The death of Charles VI of France was far more horrifying than you imagine. What you're about to discover isn't just a tale of royal madness, but the story of a king who spent his final moments convinced he was made of glass, screaming in terror as imaginary flames consumed his fragile body. The year was 1422, and the streets of Paris echoed with the cries of merchants hawking their wares and the clatter of horses on cobblestone. But within the Hôtel Saint-Paul, the royal residence, a different sound would soon pierce the autumn air. The agonized shrieks of a monarch whose mind had shattered like the very glass he believed composed his flesh, dying in a delirium so profound that even his physicians fled the chamber in horror. What transpired in those final October days was not merely the passing of a mad king, but the culmination of 3 decades of psychological torture that had transformed France's once promising sovereign into a living spectre of royal decay. The popular imagination has sanitized Charles's madness into mere eccentricity, a quirky footnote in medieval history. But the reality was far more sinister and infinitely more tragic. This was a man who had ruled one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms while battling demons that existed only in his fractured mind, demons that would ultimately drag him into a death so grotesque that courtiers would speak of it only in whispers for generations to come. If this dark chapter of history captivates you, consider subscribing to hear more untold stories from the shadows of the past. Today, we strip away the myth and examine the unflinching reality of how absolute power and absolute madness collided in one of history's most disturbing royal deaths. To understand the full horror of Charles VI's final days, we must first grasp the man he had been before madness claimed him. In 1380, at just 11 years old, Charles ascended to the throne of France with all the promise of a golden age. Contemporary accounts describe him as remarkably handsome, with flowing blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a physique that spoke of vigor and strength. He was called Charles the Beloved by his subjects, a young king who showed intelligence, compassion, and a genuine desire to heal a kingdom torn apart by war and internal strife. The transformation from beloved monarch to the Mad King began with a single catastrophic moment in the forest of Le Mans. In August 1392, while leading his troops to punish the Duke of Brittany, Charles suddenly drew his sword and began attacking his own men. The king, who moments before had been discussing military strategy, was now slashing wildly at his companions, convinced they were enemies sent to destroy him. He killed 4 of his own knights before being subdued, and when he finally came to his senses, he had no memory of the attack. This was not mere battle stress or temporary confusion. It was the first crack in a mind that would spend the next 30 years fracturing into ever smaller pieces. What made Charles's condition particularly tragic was its episodic nature. He would experience periods of complete lucidity, sometimes lasting months, during which he governed wisely and showed the same intelligence that had marked his youth. But these intervals of clarity made his descents into madness all the more devastating. One day he would be discussing trade agreements with Flemish merchants. The next, he would be found naked in the palace corridors, howling like a wolf and claiming he was St. George. The French court, already a labyrinth of political intrigue, became a theatre of the absurd as nobles struggled to govern a kingdom whose king might at any moment forget his own name. The signs of Charles's final catastrophe had been building for years, each episode more severe than the last. By 1410, his periods of madness had grown so frequent that he was lucid for only a few weeks each year. His physical appearance had deteriorated dramatically from the handsome youth he had been. His hair, once golden, had turned prematurely white and fell out in patches. His blue eyes, which had once sparkled with intelligence, now darted constantly, seeing threats in every shadow. Most disturbing was his growing obsession with his body's supposed fragility. Charles became convinced that he was made entirely of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. This glass delusion was not a simple fantasy, but an elaborate system of belief that governed every aspect of his existence. Charles had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent his glass body from breaking. He refused to let anyone come within arm's reach and would scream in terror if forced to travel by carriage, certain that the vibrations would cause him to fracture into 1,000 pieces. Palace servants were instructed to announce their presence from a distance to avoid startling the king into shattering. The man who had once led armies into battle now spent hours standing perfectly still, afraid that any movement might cause his crystalline form to crack. The political consequences of Charles's madness created a power vacuum that his queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, and his brother, Louis of Orléans, rushed to fill. But even more tragic was the treatment Charles received from those who should have protected him. During his mad periods, he was often left in squalor, his rooms uncleaned for weeks, his body covered in his own waste. Courtiers reported finding the King of France eating scraps from the floor like an animal, his royal robes replaced with rough sackcloth because he had torn his fine clothes to pieces during his fits. The man who controlled one of Europe's richest kingdoms was frequently left without basic human dignity. The betrayal went deeper than mere neglect. Queen Isabeau, who had initially shown compassion for her afflicted husband, eventually abandoned him entirely. She took a series of lovers, most notably Louis of Orleans, Charles's own brother, conducting their affair openly while the mad king wandered the palace halls. When Charles experienced his moments of lucidity and understood what was happening, the psychological torture was unbearable. Imagine awakening from madness to discover your wife in bed with your brother, your kingdom in chaos, and your children questioning whether you were truly their father. These revelations would often trigger immediate relapses, sending Charles spiraling back into delusion. By October 1421, Charles's condition had deteriorated beyond anything previously witnessed. He had not experienced a lucid moment in over 6 months, the longest continuous period of madness in his life. His delusions had evolved into something far more sinister than the glass fantasy. He now believed he was already dead, a corpse walking among the living, and that invisible flames were slowly consuming his body from within. Physicians recorded that the king would spend hours examining his hands and feet, claiming to see the flesh melting away like wax, screaming that he could smell his own burning meat. The final year of Charles's life was marked by a complete collapse of his physical health, alongside his mental deterioration. The king, who had once been robust, was now skeletal, refusing food because he believed his glass stomach would crack if filled. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, stretched tight over protruding bones. Sores covered his body from lying in bed for days at a time, too terrified to move lest he shatter. The stench in his chambers became so overwhelming that servants would vomit upon entering, and even hardened courtiers struggled to maintain composure in his presence. What few historians acknowledge is the systematic poisoning that may have accelerated Charles's decline. Recent analysis of contemporary accounts suggests that the treatments administered by his physicians, including mercury and lead-based compounds, likely exacerbated his mental symptoms while slowly destroying his body. Whether this was incompetence or something more sinister remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. The Duke of Burgundy, who had much to gain from the king's incapacitation, was known to have provided several of these physicians. Court records show that at least 3 royal doctors died under mysterious circumstances after treating Charles, their personal papers destroyed before any investigation could begin. On October 20th, 1422, Charles experienced what witnesses described as his most violent episode yet. He became convinced that the palace was on fire and that he was trapped in the flames. The king ran through the corridors, his frail body somehow finding superhuman strength, crashing into walls and furniture in his desperation to escape the imaginary inferno. His screams echoed through the palace. "I'm burning! My glass is melting! Save me from the flames!" Courtiers watched in horror as Charles tore at his own skin, claiming he needed to let the fire out from inside his body. The scene that unfolded was beyond anything the French court had witnessed. Charles, in his delirium, began pulling out his own hair and fingernails, convinced they were molten glass dripping from his burning form. Blood streamed from his self-inflicted wounds as he rolled on the floor, begging for water to extinguish flames that existed only in his tortured mind. The Dauphin, the future Charles VII, was brought to see his father but fled the chamber in tears, unable to bear the sight of the king reduced to such a state. Even the guards, hardened soldiers who had seen the horrors of war, turned away from the spectacle. As October 21st dawned, Charles's ravings had transformed into something even more disturbing. He now claimed he could see demons dancing in the flames that surrounded him, demons with the faces of those he had trusted. He pointed at empty corners of the room, identifying invisible figures as his wife, his brother, his advisors, all laughing as they watched him burn. "They set me on fire!" he screamed. "They turned me to glass so I would feel every flame." His physician, Guillaume de Harsigny, later wrote that the king's eyes in those moments showed a terror so profound that it seemed to age everyone who witnessed it. The physical toll of Charles's final delirium was catastrophic. His violent thrashing had reopened old sores and created new wounds. His throat, raw from constant screaming, could barely produce sound, yet he continued to mouth words about fire and betrayal. Most disturbing were the moments when Charles would suddenly become still and speak with perfect clarity, not the clarity of sanity, but the articulate description of his delusions. He would explain in detail how the flames were consuming him from inside, how he could feel his glass organs cracking from the heat, how each breath drew more fire into his crystalline lungs. The end came in the early hours of October 21st, 1422. Charles's screams had gradually weakened to whimpers, then to silence. But even in his final moments, witnesses reported that his eyes remained wide with terror, darting around the room as if still seeing the flames that had tormented him. His last coherent words, according to his confessor, were, "The fire! It's inside! It's always been inside." Whether he meant the imaginary flames of his delusion or some deeper understanding of the madness that had consumed his life remains unknown. When death finally claimed Charles, his body was found contorted in a position that spoke of his final agony. His hands were clenched so tightly that his fingernails had drawn blood from his palms. His face was frozen in an expression of such terror that the embalmers initially refused to prepare the body, claiming they could not bear to look upon it. The king, who had once been called the Beloved, died believing he was burning alive, trapped in a body of glass that was melting into nothingness. The immediate aftermath of Charles's death revealed the full extent of the decay that had infected the French monarchy. Courtiers who entered the death chamber found evidence of neglect that shocked even those familiar with the king's treatment. The walls were covered with strange symbols Charles had drawn in his own blood during his fits, believing them to be protective wards against the flames. Hidden throughout the room were pieces of iron and metal objects the king had collected, thinking they would prevent his glass body from breaking. Most disturbing was a collection of written fragments, produced during Charles's rare semi-lucid moments, describing in detail the tortures he believed he was experiencing. The official cause of death was recorded as fever, but those who had witnessed Charles's final days knew the truth was far more complex. The king had died of madness made manifest, his mind's delusions somehow affecting his physical body in ways that medieval medicine could not explain. Modern physicians studying the accounts have suggested everything from schizophrenia to porphyria, But no single diagnosis can fully explain the glass delusion combined with the phantom burning that tormented Charles's final years. The preparation of Charles's body for burial presented unique challenges that revealed the full horror of his physical deterioration. Embalmers reported that the king's body was so emaciated it barely seemed human, more skeleton than flesh. His skin bore countless scars from self-inflicted wounds created during his attempts to release the imaginary flames. Most unsettling was the discovery that Charles had apparently been gnawing on his own flesh in his final days, convinced it was melting glass that needed to be removed. The royal body that should have been preserved with dignity became a testament to the complete destruction of both mind and flesh. What makes Charles's death particularly haunting is the question of consciousness. Did he, in those final moments, achieve some clarity and understand the horror of what his life had become? Or did he die still trapped in his delusion, believing himself a burning glass figure in an endless inferno? His confessor claimed that just before the end, Charles's eyes showed a moment of recognition, a flash of the intelligent young king he had once been, before being swallowed again by terror. If true, that moment of clarity might have been the cruelest torture of all. The funeral of Charles VI was a carefully orchestrated piece of political theatre designed to restore dignity to the monarchy. The grotesque reality of his death was hidden behind ceremony and pageantry. His body, dressed in royal regalia and carefully positioned to hide the evidence of his self-mutilation, was displayed in Notre Dame. But those who had witnessed his final days could not forget the screaming, terrified figure who died believing he was made of glass and consumed by flames. The contrast between the dignified corpse and the reality of Charles's end created a cognitive dissonance that haunted the French court for years. Queen Isabeau, who had not visited her husband once during his final year, appeared as the grieving widow, dressed in black and weeping publicly. The hypocrisy was not lost on observers who knew of her abandonment and infidelity. The Duke of Burgundy, who many suspected had hastened the king's decline through his choice of physicians, delivered a eulogy praising Charles's wisdom and strength. The entire ceremony was a masterpiece of historical revision, attempting to erase 30 years of madness with a few hours of ritual. The legacy of Charles's madness extended far beyond his death. The power vacuum created by his incapacity had allowed the 100 Years' War to devastate France, with English forces occupying much of the kingdom. The Treaty of Troyes, signed while Charles was deep in madness, had disinherited his own son and recognized Henry V of England as the rightful heir to France. The mad king's inability to govern had nearly destroyed the very kingdom he had once been destined to glorify. His death, rather than bringing relief, only intensified the civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians that would continue to tear France apart. Perhaps most significantly, Charles's madness and death raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of divine right and royal authority. If kings ruled by God's will, what did it mean when God allowed a king to descend into such complete madness? The sight of Charles VI, covered in his own filth, screaming about being made of glass, fundamentally challenged the mystique of royalty. The careful propaganda after his death could not entirely erase the memory of a king reduced to something less than human, dying in terror of flames that existed only in his shattered mind. The medical mystery of Charles's condition continues to fascinate historians and physicians. The combination of the glass delusion with the phantom burning suggests a unique form of psychosis that may have been exacerbated by the very treatments meant to cure him. The mercury and lead-based medicines of the time could have caused neurological damage that worsened his symptoms. Some scholars have suggested that Charles suffered from a form of temporal lobe epilepsy that manifested as elaborate hallucinations. Others point to the possibility of ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, which can cause burning sensations and vivid hallucinations. Yet perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that Charles's madness was not entirely organic. The timing of his worst episodes often coincided with political crises that benefited his rivals. The physicians who treated him were often appointed by those who had the most to gain from his incapacity. The Duke of Burgundy's personal doctor, Jean de Grandson, administered treatments that seemed to worsen rather than improve the king's condition. When grandson died suddenly after expressing doubts about his treatments, his notes and formulas disappeared, destroyed by unknown hands before they could be examined. Modern analysis of Charles's symptoms reveals patterns that don't align with any single mental illness. The glass delusion was remarkably specific and consistent, maintaining its internal logic even during his worst episodes. His terror of the phantom flames showed a sensory component that went beyond typical hallucinations. He could describe the exact temperature of the flames, the way they moved through his glass body, the specific sound of glass cracking from heat. This level of detail suggests either an extraordinarily elaborate delusion or something else entirely, perhaps a combination of mental illness and systematic poisoning that created a unique form of torture. The witnesses to Charles's death carried the trauma of what they had seen for the rest of their lives. Several courtiers who had been present during his final days later reported nightmares of burning glass and phantom flames. Guillaume de Arsigny, the physician who had attended Charles in his last hours, retired from medicine entirely, claiming he could no longer practice after witnessing such suffering. The Dauphin, who became Charles VII, reportedly never spoke of his father's death and prohibited any mention of the glass delusion in his presence. The story of Charles VI forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, madness, and human cruelty. Here was a king who possessed absolute authority but could not control his own mind, surrounded by those who should have protected him, but instead exploited his vulnerability for their own gain. His death, screaming about flames that didn't exist while believing his body was made of glass, represents one of history's most disturbing intersections of mental illness and political power. As we reflect on Charles's horrific end, we must ask ourselves difficult questions about the treatment of mental illness, the corruption of power, and the human capacity for both suffering and cruelty. The mad king who died believing he was burning glass was once a golden prince full of promise. The transformation from Charles the Beloved to Charles the Mad was not inevitable, but the product of disease, possibly poison, and certainly betrayal by those closest to him. His story serves as a warning about the fragility of the human mind and the dangers of absolute power, whether wielded by the mad or those who manipulate them. The blood-soaked stones of the Hôtel Saint-Paul have long since crumbled, but the echo of Charles's final screams resonates through history. In his delusion of being made of glass, consumed by phantom flames, we see reflected our own fears of losing ourselves, of having our identity shattered and reformed into something unrecognizable. The king who died in terror of imaginary fire perhaps understood something profound about the nature of madness itself, that it burns from within, consuming everything that makes us human, leaving only the shell of what we once were. But the most haunting question remains unanswered. In those final moments, as Charles screamed about the flames consuming his glass body, was he experiencing a delusion? Or had his tormented mind found a metaphor for something real? The mysterious deaths of his physicians, the destroyed medical records, the convenient timing of his worst episodes, all these suggest that perhaps the mad king's terror was not entirely misplaced. Perhaps, in his shattered mind's imagery of burning glass, Charles VI was trying to tell us something about his fate that his broken words could never quite express. Was he simply mad, or was his madness the only way his mind could process a slow, deliberate destruction orchestrated by those who profited from his incapacity? The fire he spoke of in his last words, "It's always been inside," might have been more than delusion. It might have been the only truth a poisoned mind could speak. And if that's the case, then Charles VI didn't die of madness. He died of murder, disguised as medicine, while his screams of warning were dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. The mad king's greatest tragedy might be that in his insanity, he was telling the truth, and no one believed him. If these glimpses into history's darkest moments captivate you, subscribe to uncover more stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past.